Welcome to the Refuel Recap. This is week 4 of our C.S. Lewis Lenten study. My name's Lane Davis. I'm one of the pastors here at Brentwood United Methodist Church, and I'm so glad that you have tuned into this. So in the fall of 1939, World War II is breaking out all over Europe, and C.S. Lewis, Jack Lewis, he begins working on a book that will try and bring some understanding and some comfort to the people of Britain as they're going through this great turbulent time. He begins work on a book called The Problem of Pain, and it would become really his first book that would be both popular amongst many people as well received by a lot of critics. Now, in a lot of ways, The Problem of Pain anticipates a lot of the arguments that Lewis would make in his later book, Mere Christianity. He's seeking to make an argument for belief in God and why that is a reasonable thing, and why Christianity is the most logical system of belief that a person can have. Lewis says that he's not trying to do anything new. He's not trying to create a new theology in this particular book. What he's trying to do is restate ancient and orthodox doctrines. And I think that for the most part, he absolutely is doing that throughout the book. But as we'll see, he does get pretty imaginative and very unique with some of the doctrines that he tackles in this book. What Lewis says that paradoxically, the Christian faith actually is what creates the problem of pain. So this is kind of his line of reasoning. He says that if you're an atheist, pain is not a problem. If you're an atheist, you just believe that some particles collided in the universe, and through the accidents of evolution, here we all are on this earth. In that sense, pain isn't a problem. Pain is just the byproduct of some particles colliding in ways that cause physical or psychic discomfort. And he says that if you're a theist, and a theist is a person who just believes that there is maybe like a force or a power or animating the world, if you're a theist, pain isn't really a problem because what you really believe is that this force that's kind of moving history forward, there's no morality to it, right? It's not right or wrong. Pain is just kind of a consequence of what happens when we in history just kind of move forward. But Christianity is different, because what Christianity says is that there was this shocking historical event in which the God of the universe actually came down to earth, incarnated in the form of Jesus Christ. And if you believe that, then what you believe is that there is a God in the universe who actually loves his creation and wants creation to be righteous and a good thing. And in that case, that's when pain becomes a problem. Because in that case, pain is not the way the world is supposed to be. Pain is not just a consequence. Pain is not just particles colliding with each other. But pain means that something wrong has happened in the world. And Christianity shows that to be true. And so what Lewis says is that pain plants the flag of truth within a rebel fortress. So he then goes on to argue that basically the way suffering came about was because of human free will. That each of us were created in the image of God, meaning that we had the same free will that God had. We could freely love God, we could freely love other people, but because we are creations and because we're not the begotten image of God, that's Christ, because we're just the creations, we use that free will in ways that cause ourselves and other people pain. So that's sort of where suffering comes from. And what he says is that we can either take a trajectory towards obedience with our free will, or we can take a trajectory towards suffering and towards pride and pain. And this is where he gets into the really interesting part, to me anyway, of The Problem of Pain, which is his discussion of heaven and hell. So basically, Lewis sees pride as the ultimate sin of the human condition. Pride is when we put our own desires, we put our own selves in front of God's desires, in front of obedience to God. And so in that way, we can take two trajectories in life. One is towards sanctification and obedience towards God, and the other is pride that leads us on a path towards destruction and towards being alone, being without God. It would kind of be like this. If I just decided to replace all of my meals that I eat with only dessert, that would be what I would want, right? I love dessert. I love to eat sweets and all of that. It's good stuff. But if I only did that for so long and I ignored the advice of my friends and my doctors that I maybe need to eat some vegetables, eventually doing what I want would cause my body to literally shut down. It could literally kill me if I only ate dessert for every single meal. And Lewis says that's basically what pride does, except in a spiritual sense. That pride is putting what we want in front of what God wants for us. And if we continually do that, both in this life, then the trajectory is we'll keep doing that in eternity. We'll keep separating ourselves from God and only putting ourselves first. So in that way, Lewis doesn't see hell as like some sort of fiery furnace with, devils running around torturing people. Hell is like, an office environment where we just continually do the things that we don't want to do. It's just a continual, a continual putting ourselves in front of other people. Well, heaven then is the exact opposite. Heaven is what happens when we become more and more obedient to Christ over time. And this is what Paul says when he says in the scripture, I would like to become a slave for Christ. What Paul is saying is that obedience is ultimately what will bring us in the end the most freedom. And so the Christian finds the greatest joy and happiness in their life when they become more and more obedient. So that's Lewis in 1940 making the case for the problem of pain and suffering in the world. So fast forward 10 years to 1950. And Lewis starts a letter correspondence with a woman named Joy Davidman Gresham. Joy Davidman Gresham. And just a few years before, Joy Gresham had converted to Christianity herself. She was suffering greatly with a husband who was an alcoholic and who was abusive, and she had found a lot of comfort in the books of C.S. Lewis. And so she actually writes to him, and Lewis found her letter to be so intelligent and so engaging that he writes her back, and they begin a correspondence with each other. They become very close, in fact, close enough that Lewis actually invites her to England, and in 1952, they meet and they become fast friends, very close. In 1955, Lewis gets a professorship at Cambridge University to teach medieval and Renaissance literature, and it's during that period that Joy and Jack become even closer to each other. In fact, it's where Lewis's book "Till We Have Faces" comes out of, their conversations, and Joy could almost be called a co-writer on that book. But in 1956, the British government tells Joy that she can't stay in Britain anymore. Her visa has run out, and the only loophole to that is if she were to marry an Englishman. Lewis, being very close to her and being her very close friends, says that, okay, well, let's get married in a civil ceremony. He felt like he couldn't marry her in a church sort of sense because of theological grounds, because she was a divorcee, but he decides to marry her in a civil ceremony. So she's able to stay in England. She moves to Oxford, and they remain very close. And it's shortly a couple of months after they get married in this civil ceremony that Joy becomes sick. And she's taken to the doctor and is diagnosed with cancer. She has some surgeries to remove the cancer, but doctors don't give her very long to live. It's during this period of Joy's sickness that Jack comes to realize that he truly does love Joy. That he is in love with her, and so he seeks to find a way that they can get married in the eyes of God. So in talking with friends and with pastors, they decide that it is theologically okay, and so they're actually married in Joy's house, in her sick room, by a pastor from the Church of England. She moves into Lewis's house, the Kilns, a few days later, and a lot of friends think that she is moving in there. That'll be her last move, that she'll die. After that, kind of a miracle happens. Lewis is praying for his new wife constantly, and he's praying that he can actually take on some of her suffering. And what actually happens is that Jack all of a sudden becomes very ill himself. He's diagnosed with osteoporosis. His bones are breaking down. But at the same time, Joy is having this very amazing quick recovery. And for the next couple of years, Jack recovers himself after a while. They share some of the happiest years of their lives. They travel together to Ireland, to Greece. They are just in love with each other. And C.S. Lewis writes that these are probably the happiest years of his entire life. But a couple of years after they're married, Joy once again falls ill. And in July of 1959, Joy is taken to the hospital one day after suffering from extreme pain, and that evening passes away. Jack then goes into some extreme grief, and he deals with it in the only way that he knows how to, by writing. And so he begins to write out in sort of a very internally searching way, almost like he's writing a journal. And it would become this book called A Grief Observed. It's so raw and emotional that he doesn't even publish it under his own name. He publishes it under a different name, N.W. Clerk. And he would actually give it to his friends and say, if they were going through a hard time, like if they were suffering through grief, he would give it to them and say, I hope this is helpful. A friend of mine wrote this. He wouldn't publish it under his own name until 1964, and it wouldn't be till then that it actually sold a lot of copies. But if you go back and you read through this book, it is just this raw and emotional time of this man really teetering on the edge of faith. Trying to figure out all of this theoretical stuff that he had worked out all these years earlier in a book like Mere Christianity or The Problem of Pain, and all of a sudden it's a reality for him. And his faith is tested. He feels like he's hanging from a rope, he writes, and he wasn't sure if he trusted that the rope was strong enough for him. I would recommend this book for anyone that has ever dealt with the loss of a loved one, for anyone who has ever dealt with extreme grief and has wondered whether or not their faith is strong enough to survive that test. This is a book that speaks to the heart and the soul in the way that none of the other C.S. Lewis books do, I think. So it's an interesting trajectory, going from Lewis's theoretical work on suffering and pain to seeing how he actually deals with it as a Christian. And I think it's a model for us as Christians as well. We can have all the head knowledge in the world, but without the assurance that God has saved us, without the assurance that Christ is there for us, all that head knowledge means nothing. So I hope this recap has been helpful for you. I would encourage you to go back, read A Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed, understand what Lewis is trying to do there, and I hope that you'll join us for our last week of our C.S. Lewis study. It'll be Wednesday nights at Brentwood United Methodist Church starting at 5:45, or check this recap next week as well. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you soon.